We are told that Derinkuyu was an ancient refuge, a place carved by early Christians, possibly in the 7th or 8th century, to hide from Arab raids. That is the explanation on record. It is in the textbooks. It is on the tourism placards, and by most accounts, it is considered settled. But here's what the physical structure actually shows. Derinkuyu descends 18 stories below ground. It held, by current estimates, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people, along with their livestock, food stores, ventilation systems, wineries, oil presses, schools, and chapels. The ventilation shafts, over 50 of them, were bored vertically through solid volcanic rock with such precision that they continue to function today. The main shaft alone drops 85 meters. It maintains airflow for every level simultaneously. The official explanation says this was done with iron tools, fire, and water. The rock is soft tough. That part is true. But the engineering problem is not the material. It is the coordination. You cannot ventilate a structure while you are still carving it. You have to know, before you begin, where every shaft needs to exit at the surface, across a footprint that spans several city blocks. That requires surveying, vertical mapping, calculated load distribution across 18 floors so the ceiling of one level does not collapse under the weight of the next. That kind of planning does not appear in the record. The record simply says people hid here. Visual cross-section diagram of Derinkuyu. Depth markers, shaft angles, floor plans. Here is where the investigation starts. In 2013, construction crews in Neverhair, the modern city built directly above the Cappadocia region, began demolishing old structures to build a housing project. Underneath the foundations, they found tunnels. Not the known tunnels of Derinkuyu, which had been open to tourism since 1969. New tunnels, an entirely separate underground complex, stretching beneath the modern city in multiple directions. The Turkish Housing Development Administration halted construction. Archaeologists moved in. What they began to document was, by preliminary measurements, larger than Derinkuyu itself, possibly the largest underground city ever discovered. As of current reporting, the excavation remains ongoing. The full extent has not been published. There is no comprehensive map available to the public. That is worth pausing on. A structure potentially larger than a city that held 50,000 people, discovered beneath a living modern town, and the documentation made publicly available is minimal. The official position is that excavation is simply slow. That is plausible. But it does not explain why the preliminary findings from 2013 have not been followed by a single complete architectural survey released for independent review. The evidence doesn't disappear, only the explanation does. Visual, aerial map of Cappadocia, dots indicating known underground sites, lines connecting them through estimated tunnel networks. Derinkuyu is not isolated. It is connected, via tunnels, to at least Kamakli, another underground city approximately 9 kilometers away. Kamakli itself has 8 documented levels, though only 4 are currently open to visitors. The other 4 are described as unstable. Whether that instability is geological or administrative is not specified. Between Derinkuyu and Kamakli, the connecting tunnel runs underground for the full distance. Researchers have identified at least 200 underground cities in the Cappadocia region. 200. Of varying sizes, varying depths, varying complexity. The official explanation for all of them is essentially the same: refuge from raids. This is where a technical problem appears. If these structures were emergency refuges, their engineering reflects something beyond emergency construction. Derinkuyu's door locking system consists of massive circular stone discs, some weighing close to half a ton, that rolled across tunnel entrances from the inside. Each disc had a small hole bored through its center, positioned precisely to allow a spear or pike to pass through and threaten anyone attempting to push the stone from the outside. This is not improvised construction. This is a security system with a specific threat model built into its geometry. Whoever designed it understood siege tactics, understood how attackers would attempt entry, accounted for that in the physical structure itself. The question is not whether it exists, it does. The question is, what kind of society produces that level of integrated defensive engineering and leaves no written design record behind? Nah. Visual. Close-up of the circular stone doors, the hole bored through the center, the rolling track worn smooth into the floor. Now move the investigation west. Underground. Beneath Edinburgh, Scotland, A set of sealed stone vaults runs under the South Bridge, built in 1788. When the bridge was completed, the arches beneath it were intended as commercial storage space. Within a few decades, they had been sealed off and forgotten. Rediscovered in 1985. The Edinburgh vaults are not ancient. The construction date is known, but their condition, when rediscovered, and what was found inside, raises a separate kind of question. The vaults had been used, then deliberately sealed, not collapsed, not abandoned carelessly, sealed. Evidence of occupation was found throughout, remnants of cobbling tools, storage containers, material suggesting long-term habitation rather than short-term storage. The official explanation characterizes the vaults as slum housing, that Edinburgh's urban poor occupied the spaces after the commercial use failed. That is likely accurate for some portion of the occupation period, but it does not account for why the vaults were systematically sealed from the outside, or what the full sequence of use looked like before the historical record picks it up. Edinburgh's underground network extends well beyond the Southbridge vaults. Mary King's Close, a full street sealed beneath the Royal Mile, was rediscovered during construction and is now a tourist site. The city acknowledges that the full extent of sealed underground passages beneath the old town has not been comprehensively mapped. A city, built on top of a city, built on top of passages, built on top of earlier construction. Each layer sealed and built over. The official explanation for each layer exists. The explanation for why so much was sealed rather than demolished. Why it was more practical to bury entire streets than clear them, is less fully examined. Visual. Interior of Mary King's Close. Stone walls. Lowered ceilings where later floors were built directly on top of existing structures. Move further. Paris. The Paris catacombs are described as an 18th century solution to an overcrowding problem in the city's cemeteries. The explanation is administratively coherent. Paris was running out of burial space. Bones were transferred to the old limestone quarries beneath the city, and the result is the ossuary that now draws tourists annually. That explanation covers the ossuary. It does not cover the rest of the network. The quarry tunnels beneath Paris extend for approximately 300 kilometers. The ossuary section, the part that is officially mapped, maintained, and open, is roughly 2 kilometers. The remaining 298 kilometers are officially off-limits. They are called les carrières de Paris, the quarries of Paris. They are not fully mapped. There are sections where the current survey is acknowledged to be incomplete. In those unsanctioned sections, there is evidence of long-term habitation. Painted murals, constructed rooms, spaces that were not quarried but built, walls assembled from cut stone within the tunnel network, creating interior rooms with no connection to the surface infrastructure above them. The official framing describes this as the work of urban explorers, cataphiles, in the modern era. Some of it certainly is, but some of what has been documented archaeologically in the deeper sections does not date to the modern era. In 2004, police responding to a report of activity in the restricted tunnels discovered a fully equipped cinema projection room, screen, seating for roughly 20 people, a bar, and a connected restaurant space with a power supply whose source was not immediately identified. When they returned the following day to investigate the power supply, the equipment was gone. A note had been left. It read, in translation, "Do not try to find us." That event is on record. It is documented in French police reports. It is real. The question it raises is not who built the cinema. The question it raises is how long an active, organized community can exist in an officially sealed and monitored underground system and not be located. 300 kilometers is the partial answer. Visual, interior tunnel junction in the Paris quarries. Fork in the passage. No signage. Now introduce a different layer of the investigation. In 2007, workers in Cappadocia discovered something during a different kind of construction project. Not housing, but road expansion near the town of Ogenak. Under the roadbed, they found the entrance to an underground complex that had not been previously catalogued. Ogenak had been known since 1972, but the new tunnels extended beyond the mapped site. What made Ogenak technically notable when it was first documented? Its ventilation shafts included a specific feature. The shafts were designed so that airflow could be restricted or redirected, not just bored for passive ventilation, actively designed to control the direction and volume of air moving through the system. Passive ventilation in a sealed underground space is an engineering challenge. controlled ventilation, where you can direct airflow to specific sections while limiting it to others, is a significantly more advanced problem. It requires understanding the pressure dynamics of the full system before the system is complete. You cannot test that system as you build it. You cannot discover through trial and error that your ventilation shaft for level 14 needs to be offset 17 meters to the east because of the pressure created by the shaft on level 9. By the time you are building level 14, levels 1 through 13 are already carved. Any error in the design is permanent. The official explanation does not address how that pressure mapping was done. It notes that the ventilation works. It does not explain the knowledge required to make it work before the first stone was cut. Visual cross-section of Oz-Konak ventilation system. Arrows indicating directional airflow. Offset shaft positions. Move to a different continent. Not to find parallels to underground cities specifically, but to ask a structural question about knowledge. Beneath the Mayan city of Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico, a network of water channels runs under the constructed city. Some channels are covered with corbelled stone arches, the same interlocking technique used in Mayan above-ground construction. The system managed water pressure during the rainy season by creating what modern hydraulic engineers describe as a functioning pressure release system. It was not discovered until modern archaeological survey tools were applied. It had been beneath the excavated city for decades of study before subsurface imaging revealed its extent. The system works on the same fundamental principle as the ventilation design in Cappadocia. You must understand the full system before you build any part of it. The pressure problem at one end of a sealed channel affects the behavior at the other end. The solution has to be designed as a whole. Two separate civilizations. Two separate continents. No documented contact. Both constructing underground systems that require whole system understanding before construction begins, and leaving no written record of how that understanding was acquired. The official explanation for each site is local. The pattern is not. Visual, split screen. Cappadocia shaft cross-section. Palenque channel cross-section. Same angle. Different continent. Return to Turkey. To a detail that is easy to overlook in the broader scale of Derinkuyu. On the third level of the complex, there is a room that archaeologists have classified as a school. The basis for that classification is its layout. Benches cut directly into the rock, arranged in rows with a cleared space at one end that suggests a front-facing focal point. Schools require sustained population. If Derinkuyu was a refuge used intermittently during raids, a school on the third level underground suggests populations that were not just hiding temporarily. They were living, for extended periods, long enough that educating children was a logistical priority that required dedicated, carved, permanent infrastructure. A room carved from solid rock is not built for a few weeks of hiding. The labor investment of cutting a permanent school into volcanic tuff 18 meters underground reflects an expectation of long-term occupancy or a regularity of occupancy that made permanent infrastructure more practical than temporary solutions. The official explanation acknowledges the room. It classifies it. It does not fully reconcile the labor investment of permanent carved infrastructure with the framing of temporary refuge use. That gap is not large, but it is consistent. Across Derinkuyu, across Kamakli, across the sites of Cappadocia, the infrastructure is consistently more permanent, more engineered, and more planned than an intermittent use refuge model would reasonably require. Visual, the carved schoolroom in Derinkuyu, stone benches, smooth walls, the cleared space at the front of the room. Now ask about documentation. The Hittites occupied Anatolia, the region that includes Cappadocia, from roughly 1600 to 1200 BCE. They are one of the most extensively documented Bronze Age civilizations in the record. Their archives at Hattusa contain tens of thousands of clay tablets, administrative records, military correspondence, religious texts, trade agreements. The Hittite records do not mention Derinkuyu. The Phrygians followed, occupying the region from approximately 1200 to 700 BCE. Their material culture is well documented archaeologically. They left inscriptions, sculpture, architectural remains at Gordian and other sites. The Phrygian record does not mention Derinkuyu. The Persians controlled the region from roughly 550 BCE onward. Greek historians documented Persian administrative structures in Anatolia in considerable detail. The Greek and Persian records do not mention Derinkuyu. The Romans occupied the region for centuries. Roman administrative documentation of the provinces of Anatolia is extensive. The Roman record does not mention Derinkuyu, a city capable of housing 50,000 people, in a region continuously occupied and administratively documented by multiple literate civilizations over more than 1,000 years, and none of those civilizations recorded it. The official explanation suggests it was simply not considered significant enough to document, or that the documentation existed and has not survived. Both explanations are possible. Neither is fully satisfying. A water source, a road, a garrison of 200 soldiers, all of these are documented in the regional records. A city of 50,000 people beneath the ground is, by any administrative logic, more significant than a garrison of 200. The silence is not proof of anything. But it is unusual, and unusual silences in otherwise detailed records are worth examining rather than dismissing. Visual clay tablets from the Hattusa archive, dense cuneiform text, row after row of administrative record. There is a recurring pattern across these sites that the investigation keeps returning to. It is not the scale of the construction. Scale can be explained by organized labor and time. It is not the tools. Tough is soft. Limestone is workable. Given enough labor, most materials yield to persistent effort. The pattern is in the design prerequisite. Every complex underground system, ventilation, drainage, defensive architecture, structural load distribution, requires knowing the final state of the system before the first cut is made. You cannot ventilate a building you haven't designed yet. You cannot manage water pressure in a channel whose outlet position you haven't determined. You cannot distribute the weight load of 18 floors if you are discovering the geology floor by floor. These systems exist, they function. They have been functioning, in some cases, for centuries without maintenance. What does not exist is any transitional record, no intermediate designs, no earlier, simpler versions of the same technology in the same region that show a development curve, no texts describing the engineering principles, no apprenticeship records, no failed attempts preserved in the archaeological record alongside the successful ones. In almost every other area of ancient technology, you find the development curve. You find early, imperfect versions that improve over generations. Pottery, metallurgy, writing itself. The record of development exists because development happened and it left physical evidence. For the integrated underground engineering, visible in Cappadocia, in Paris, in Edinburgh, in Palenque, the development curve is absent. The capability appears, is used, and in many cases, disappears. The next civilization to occupy the same region typically does not continue or improve the underground engineering. They build on top of it. That is an unusual pattern. Development curves don't typically vanish. They slow, they change direction, they get interrupted, but they leave traces. The trace here is the structure itself. What is missing is everything that should have come before it. Visual, timeline graphic, known civilizations in Cappadocia, gap where underground construction origin should appear, ? Return once more to the 2013 discovery in Nevhir. The preliminary reports describe the new complex as containing evidence of a chapel, storage areas, and water channels, consistent with Derinkuyu in function. The estimated size was reported in multiple outlets as potentially larger than any previously known underground city in the region. The Turkish government classified portions of the excavation area as a protected heritage zone, which halted the housing construction. That is the appropriate administrative response, and it is documented. What is also documented, as of the most recent available reporting, no comprehensive architectural survey of the full complex has been released. No independent archaeological team has published a complete site analysis. The excavation is described as ongoing. The Nevşehir complex, if the preliminary size estimates are accurate, would be the most significant underground discovery in modern archaeological history. Sites of far lesser significance. A Roman road segment, a Bronze Age cooking vessel, a medieval coin hoard, generate immediate, detailed publication in peer-reviewed journals. The official position remains. Excavation is slow, and publication follows completed work. That is a coherent, institutional position. It is also, in this context, worth noting as a pattern. The larger the site, the slower the documentation becomes publicly available. Whether that reflects the genuine complexity of excavation or something else is not a conclusion this investigation reaches. It is an observation about the pattern. Visual. The construction site in Nevhir, 2013, cordoned off. Equipment halted. a gap in the earth where the tunnel entrance was found. Now consider what construction itself keeps revealing. Not in Turkey, not in France, but in places where nobody was looking for anything underground at all. In 2016, during the expansion of a metro line in Naples, Italy, workers broke through into a cave system beneath the Piazza Municipio. What they found was not a natural formation. The walls had been cut. The floors had been leveled. There were cisterns, carved channels, and what appeared to be a network of connecting passages extending beyond the construction boundary. Naples already had a known underground, the Napoli Sotterranea, a documented system of Greek and Roman tunnels, cisterns, and wartime shelters that runs beneath much of the historic center. What the metro workers found in 2016 was not that system. It was deeper. And its construction style did not match the documented Roman or Greek phases. The Italian Archaeological Authority halted the metro work and began excavation. They found Greek-era amphorae, Roman-era structural modifications built over and into an earlier carved system, layer over layer, each civilization finding what was already there and adapting it rather than replacing it. The question the Naples site raises is not archaeological, it is logistical. If Roman engineers constructing in Naples in the 1st century BCE found a pre-existing tunnel network and chose to build into it rather than remove it, that decision reflects a practical judgment. The existing network was more useful than a cleared site. It was sound enough to build on. It was, in their estimation, worth keeping. That judgment tells us something about the quality of what they found. You do not incorporate a collapsing or unreliable structure into new construction. You demolish it and start fresh. The Romans chose not to. That choice is preserved in the physical layering of the site. What they chose to preserve, and what was already there when they arrived, remains only partially excavated. Visual, Naples Metro Excavation Site, 2016. Archaeological layer markers, visible stratigraphic cuts showing multiple construction phases. There is one more technical detail that the investigation has not yet addressed directly. It concerns water. Every large underground habitation faces the same primary threat: groundwater infiltration. A space carved below grade in any region with seasonal rainfall will accumulate water. Without active drainage management, it becomes uninhabitable within years, not centuries. Derinkuyu is dry. Its carved rooms do not flood. The water management system, channels cut to direct infiltration away from habitation areas and toward collection cisterns, works passively, without pumps, without maintenance, without anyone managing it for potentially hundreds of years between occupation periods. The cisterns in Derinkuyu are positioned at specific levels relative to the surrounding geology. They capture infiltration from above and channel it downward without allowing it to migrate horizontally into the living spaces. That positioning is not accidental. It reflects a detailed understanding of the local water table, where water enters the rock, at what depth, under what seasonal pressure conditions. You cannot acquire that knowledge by living underground for a few seasons. That knowledge requires either long observation of the specific site prior to construction, or an existing body of hydrological understanding that was applied to a new location. Neither of those sources appears in the record. The cisterns work. The water table knowledge that produced their positioning does not have a documented origin. And in the Nevşehir complex, discovered in 2013, the preliminary reports noted the presence of water channels consistent with those in Derinkuyu. The same water management logic applied to a different site, suggesting the same body of knowledge was applied more than once across more than one location by whoever was doing the building. That pattern, consistent application of advanced hydrological knowledge across multiple sites with no surviving documentation of that knowledge, is the same pattern the ventilation systems suggest. The same pattern the defensive architecture suggests. The knowledge was used systematically. Then it was not used at all. The structures it produced outlasted it by an interval we cannot currently measure because we do not know when the knowledge disappeared. We only know that it is not in the record. Visual, the cistern level of Derinkuyu. Dry stone walls. Cut channels still directing water away from the carved floor. No standing water. The investigation ends where it began. Underground, in the dark, looking at something that functions perfectly and came from nowhere in the record. Derinkuyu's ventilation works today. You can feel the air moving through it. After potentially thousands of years, without maintenance, without the civilization that built it, the airflow continues. The system was designed so well that it requires nothing from us to keep functioning. We can measure it. We can map it. We can calculate the engineering tolerances required to produce it. We cannot, with the resources and precision of modern archaeological method, fully account for where the knowledge to design it came from, when exactly it was built, why the civilization that built it left no written record of the process, and why no civilization that came after, in a continuously occupied region, ever attempted to build anything comparable. The Edinburgh streets are sealed beneath later construction. The Paris quarries extend beyond any complete map. The Naples metro cut through something that 3 prior civilizations had already built over. The Nave-Shen-Hare complex sits behind an excavation barrier that has been in place for over a decade. What we have, consistently across these sites, is infrastructure that outlasted the knowledge required to produce it. The structures survived. The understanding of how they were planned, how the water was managed, how the air was moved, how the weight was distributed, did not. And that is a specific kind of loss, not the loss of a building, which can be seen and measured. The loss of the process, the survey methods, the pressure calculations, the hydrological mapping, the whole system design prerequisite is invisible. It leaves no ruin. It leaves only a working system and a gap where the explanation should be. Modern engineering can replicate these structures given enough time and equipment. What it cannot replicate is the condition under which they were originally built, without the benefit of the engineering knowledge we now take as the prerequisite for the task. The question is not whether someone built these cities. They were built. The question is what they knew before they started, and where that knowledge went when the building stopped. The cisterns are still dry. The ventilation shaft still moves air through 18 floors of carved stone. The water channels still direct infiltration away from rooms that no one has occupied in centuries. The design documents for all of it have never been found.